Okay, this is the last chapter that we're going to review in the course, and it is verbal behavior. So, this chapter actually was right after the chapter on stimulus control, and there's some good reason for that. It fits well in the sequence of concepts within behavior analysis. However, I like to present this material at the end for two reasons. One, because I think it's sort of an area unto itself in the field of behavior analysis. There are a lot of folks who specialize in the area of verbal behavior. So I like to treat it as its sort of own subject. Secondly, most of you, if not all of you, will be entering the ABA 513 class in the summer, which falls in sequence following this course. So I like the idea of having this chapter being presented in close proximity to when you enter that course, because it'll give you a strong foundation. Now, that said, this is really only to provide an overview of the content. It's a really dense area. There's a tremendous amount of new terminology, but I think you'll find that all of the concepts that you have been taught apply here. It's just sort of a slightly different form of behavior. So with that, let's jump into the chapter. So when we talk about verbal behavior, we are obviously referring to a behavior. The idea of it being verbal does not necessarily just mean vocal. Gestures can be verbal. A picture card exchange can be verbal. So we'll see that Skinner takes a very different approach to analyzing really what could be conceptualized as language in general than most other theorists. So if you consider some of the general theories on language and how language is acquired, there are three general theories. One is a biological theory, and the second is a cognitive theory. And both of these areas are really sort of embraced by Noam Chomsky, who is now more of a political analyst, commentator. But he was at MIT early on, and he's working in the area of linguistics. And when Skinner wrote his verbal behavior book in 1957, Chomsky responded to it with really a scathing response. And without getting into too many details about that, I'm sure it'll be covered in ABA 513. Really, Chomsky missed the whole point of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. Again, all of you will be reading Verbal Behavior in the summer, so I don't want to dwell on sort of the content of that book and what Chomsky was responding to. But nevertheless, it was an important point in behavior analysis because it sort of ushered in the cognitive revolution. Psychologists and psychology departments across the nation changed from a very behavioral viewpoint or theoretical viewpoint to more of a cognitive viewpoint, really based on Chomsky's review as well as other things. But so it's sort of an important point. It is interesting to note that behaviorism never went away, and now it's actually become more than popular these days. So if you look at a lot of university programs, many, if not most, have a behavior analysis department, or program at least. Okay, so with that, the biological approach that was emphasized by Chomsky indicates that as humans, the capacity to acquire language is innate. That is, we are sort of born with this capacity to acquire language, but not only that the language we acquired is sort of grammatically correct. The thing that overlooks is the environmental component, that we acquire language and it may eventually become grammatically correct and so forth because we are in a verbal community. We can never separate those two areas, that there's sort of our genetics when we're born, but we're born into a verbal community. And our language that develops as children, adolescents, and so forth is shaped by our verbal community, our immediate verbal community, our family, as well as our sort of extended verbal community, the areas we grow up. All of you who are raised in New Jersey will probably have had some experience, if you've ever left New Jersey, where somebody comments about the way you say certain things. And I've had these experiences too, certainly after I graduated my undergraduate at Rutgers and moved to Maryland. A lot of folks would crack jokes at the fact that I would say "yous guys," the plural of you, and all those good Jerseyisms. So that is a part of our verbal community. That is why we speak that way. Hopefully, as we enter more professional circles, we change our language, because that is a different verbal community. So the biological approach is that our ability to acquire language is innate. The cognitive approach really focuses on classifying language, coding and encoding ideas, right? I'm sure all of you have learned in some psychology course, maybe even the psychology of learning, that language is transmitting ideas. So ideas are sort of coded, they're transmitted and to somebody else and encoded, and they're stored and things of that nature. So language is really controlled by some internal cognitive processes. Well, not surprisingly, Skinner took a different approach, and that is that verbal behavior is acquired in the same way that all of our other behavior is. So if you think about much of the behavior we talked about thus far in the class, we could sort of categorize it as motor type behaviors. Anything from writing to walking to perhaps some of the individuals we work with engaging in problem behavior, academic type behaviors. So those all tend to be motor behaviors. And there's probably a primary focus on that because those behaviors are overt and we can observe them and collect data and so forth. Well, verbal behavior is overt as well, right? If somebody is speaking or gesturing, we can observe and record those instances of behavior, and we can analyze the controlling variables. Now, of course, verbal behavior can get more complex because when we think, typically we think in words, maybe images, but let's just focus on thinking in words, sort of solving a problem in your head. We use verbal behavior, but it's not accessible to a community of observers, right? So we'll talk about that as well. But generally, Skinner's approach is that the verbal behavior is acquired and extended in the same way that other behavior is. He refers to a vocal musculature, so that can be sort of tied in with our biology. We all have, I'm not a biologist or a doctor in any way like that, but we have the vocal cords and a physical capacity to produce sounds, and that, of course, is very important. And when we are developing as a baby, that musculature comes under operant control. Let's just break it down real simple. When babies are born, they can cry, right? In fact, that is all they can do. They can maybe do some other things, but generally from day one, they can cry. Over time, that crying becomes discriminated. And if anybody is a parent or has interacted with a new parent, you will probably notice that parents seem to acquire the ability to discriminate what cries mean, right? Certain cries seem to indicate that the baby is hungry. Certain cries seem to indicate that the baby needs to be changed. Certain cries seem to indicate that the baby just wants to be held. So that's sort of a real rudimentary example of behavior, verbal behavior, just the sound of crying coming under operant control, right? It is reflexive early on, but once a baby learns that when I cry, mom and dad come, then the behavior of crying can come under operant control. It could get, as mentioned, it could get more complex, right? Because think of it from a new parent's perspective, a cry is a cry, but eventually that cry can become discriminated. And as I mentioned, a different crying sound when the baby's hungry, right? That would be very efficient if the baby learned to cry in a particular tone, because at that point, the mom or dad always brought a bottle or fed the baby. So, again, that's my own sort of speculation, interpretation, by way of example. But I think it makes a case. So our verbal community shapes and maintains a speaker's behavior. As you can imagine, when the baby develops, the crying and the sounds it makes become more discriminated and more unique, right? A baby stops crying and starts babbling. Then they could eventually form approximations to words. All the while, the parents are shaping that behavior, even if not intentionally teaching the verbal behavior, just by the consequences they're providing, whether they're coming to pick the baby up or providing food or providing models. All of these play a role in the development of a single child's language. Okay, so that's that. Most theories of language tend to focus on the form, right? So that is a topography of what is being spoken. So we are, in this case, we're really just talking about vocal language. So, and the structure of language, so the grammar of language. Linguistics focuses on that, speech and language therapy, and so forth. The behavioral approach, it focuses on the function of language. And this is where we tie directly into Skinner's general ideas of operant conditioning. That is, language serves a function. So behavior analysis doesn't really spend much time focusing on things like grammar and syntax and structure. Language is really focused on with respect to its function, whereas in other theories, it's analyzed without regard to what the speaker is saying or why they said it. It's more the form of how it is said. So once again, big take home here is, in the behavior analytic view, language is a learned behavior, and it's acquired and extended and manipulated or shaped in the same ways as a nonverbal behavior. Taking that a step further, the verbal behavior is reinforced through the mediation of another person's behavior. Now, this is going to be important, and this is sort of where it is slightly different than motor behavior, right? We eventually, when we become fairly adept at language, we communicate with other people, really in an attempt to mediate the behavior of other people. If I'm thirsty and I'm at somebody's house, I ask them, "May I have a drink, please?" And that verbal response results in them performing some action that is a reinforcer for me, bringing me a drink. Okay, so we're really going to focus on the function rather than the form. And the two critical roles are that of a speaker and that of a listener. So Skinner, in an attempt to sort of tie in this new area of verbal behavior with the existing science on operant conditioning, he avoided common terms used in like speech and language therapy, things like expressive language and receptive language, and really, again, focused more on function. And to do that, he developed a new terminology, and we'll talk about that terminology. And that is probably one of the more difficult things about understanding verbal behaviors is really knowing the terminology. Okay, but let's just focus on verbal behavior generally. So forms of verbal behavior, whenever we say verbal behavior, it could mean vocal behavior. So that is speaking as I am into this microphone. Written behavior can be verbal, and gestures. Verbal behavior operates on a listener or a reader or an observer, right? So each of these listeners, other people really tie into the form of the verbal behavior. So it's going to allow us to have, as a speaker, verbal behavior is going to allow us to have an effect on the environment indirectly. And the contingencies that regulate our verbal behavior arise from the practices within the community. So let's just kind of take a couple examples here. We covered functional communication training. Now, that is a form of verbal behavior. It can be really any one of these. It can be vocal, functional communication. We could teach a vocal response. We could teach a written response, or a symbolic response, if you will, like a picture card, or a gesture, pointing or sign language. And it's going to operate on the listener. So if problem behavior is maintained by social negative reinforcement in the form of escape, we teach the individual to use the sign, break please, right? And the observer delivers the reinforcer for that gesture. Now, we'll keep things simple because we can't really go beyond that in this course. It'll get covered in ABA 513. But let's just sort of bring up a couple more general examples of this, of verbal behavior being regulated by the practices of a verbal community. As I mentioned, growing up in New Jersey, saying something like "yous guys, what are yous guys doing?" Is not odd. When you leave New Jersey, that is an odd statement. Embarrassing myself here, but another thing I got called out on when I moved out of New Jersey was ending sentences and prepositions. Where did you park the car at? Right? That is unique to this area, New York, New Jersey, so forth. People in the rest of the country do not speak that way. But that practice, or that inappropriate form of verbal behavior, was shaped and maintained by my local verbal community. In fact, both of my parents still say "yous guys," and it sounds like nails on a chalkboard these days. But they grew up in South Philly and New Jersey, so that's our verbal community. Now let's bring it into where all of you are now. You are in an ABA program, which is a unique profession, and there's a professional language. So if, for example, my parents say, "Well, do you reinforce the child?" I'm not going to make a big deal about that. But in our community, saying that is incorrect. So you should all say, "We reinforce the behavior," right? Because that is the practice of our verbal community. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the verbal community operates on many levels for each individual. Certainly within the family, there are verbal practices. Within your local town, there are verbal practices. Within different regions in New Jersey, maybe within different cultures, there are verbal practices. And then, of course, when you enter into professions, verbal practices. So the communities regulate verbal behavior. All right, let's jump into sort of the units of analysis here. So when we talk about verbal behavior, the simplest unit is a verbal operant. And we can think of that as just an operant, right? When we talk about basic behavior analysis and we refer to a lever press or a key press, that is an operant behavior. All of our behavior most of it is operant. So vocal or verbal behavior is a verbal operant. We're going to make that distinction, verbal operant. It is influenced, as you might imagine, by the three-term contingency. And of course, motivating operations play a significant role, and we're going to really drive that point home as we go through each of the verbal operants. So Skinner outlined, as I mentioned, a unique terminology Some of it is sort of readily apparent why he may have selected these terms, but other ones are sort of unique and different. But the reason he did that again is to distinguish the different verbal operants from common terminology or terminology used in areas like linguistics or speech and language therapy and things of that nature. All right, so these are the verbal operants, the main ones: the mand, a tact, an echoic, an intraverbal, a textual, and transcription. The ones we tend to focus on most in behavior analysis are mands and tacts, echoics, and intraverbals. So I'm really going to spend a lot of time on mands, tacts, echoics, not so much time on the rest of these because you will get more than you'd ever wished when you enter in ABA 513. So a mand is a verbal operant. You could think of it as a command. Sometimes it's casually referred to as a request. But again, we want to keep things a unique terminology for our profession. So the interesting thing about a mand is it's a verbal operant that specifies its reinforcer. Before getting into the rest, let's just go through some examples. So when we talk about FCT, teaching a child to request a break, the verbal operant, whether it's gesture or a picture card exchange or vocal, is specifying what the reinforcer is. The reinforcer is a break. When I request a glass of water, that verbal operant is specifying the reinforcer. Water, please. So, given that, again, we think of it as a request casually, but it is under functional control of a motivating operation. That means the mand or a verbal operant, this verbal operant, is not going to occur if there is no motivating operation present. So let's kind of fill that out. If I am thirsty, right, I've been deprived of water for some time, there is a motivating operation. That water is a valuable reinforcer, and I'm likely to engage in behavior to access water. Well, one behavior I can engage in is to request water. So once I've had enough water and my thirst, if you will, has been satiated, there is no longer a motivation. So I don't walk around saying, water, please, if there is no motivation to do so. Okay, so that is an important part. That is the primary controlling variable. Mands occur because there's a motivating operation present. Obviously, it requires the presence of a listener, right? When we mand for something or we make a request, there's a motivation, but we're requesting of somebody else, right? So somebody else is providing the reinforcer. Manding for information. Something like, Dr. Wilson, when is the presentation due? Right? That you are manding for reinforcement. Asking for directions, asking for help, asking for water, asking for food. All of these mands result in the listener doing something. Now, if you kind of think about this, obviously, mands are maintained by the consequence of the listener. If I went to somebody's house and every time I asked for a drink, there was never anything to drink, I would not, even if there was an MO, I would not engage in the mand, right? Because it's not reinforced in this context. So don't dwell on that too much, but let's just focus on a mand being under functional control of a motivating operation, and the consequence is the listener providing the reinforcer. So we're going to go through some verbal exchange diagrams to help illustrate all the different components of discriminative stimuli, consequences, and responses. And all of these actually show up in the verbal behavior book. I think there are some examples in the textbook as well. So bear with me here. Obviously, you know that an SD is a discriminative stimulus. The diagrams are going to refer to capital R subscript V for verbal response. We can consider a discriminative verbal stimuli, right? So as a listener, when somebody makes a command, I am encountering a verbal stimulus. There can be an aversive stimulus, an aversive verbal response, and verbal reinforcement. So, we'll kind of keep all of these in mind as we go through these examples. So basic manned request, if we were to diagram it, might look something like this, right? There's a speaker, there's a listener. So being the speaker, the listener is the audience, right? There is some motivating operation in place. So I request water, verbal response. The listener, we can consider that a verbal discriminative stimulus, right? They're hearing me say water, please. They engage in a response by providing me water. So I've received reinforcement. The verbal response has been reinforced. Plus, there's now another discriminative stimulus. I say thank you. They say you're welcome, and so forth. The verbal exchange has ended. And you don't need to get too caught up in all of these diagrams, but I do want you to sort of acknowledge each of the concepts that are sort of being illustrated in a simple verbal exchange. There's discriminative stimuli. Some of them are verbal. And there are responses and reinforcers being delivered. Here's one where there's a question, right? So in the presence of an audience, that is a listener, I may say, engage in a verbal response. What's your name? The listener, now there's a question, and we're going to talk about this point here, what a question sort of evokes in terms of motivation. I make a verbal response, David, and reinforcer, and so forth. The verbal exchange continues. Questions are interesting. Not only is the question a verbal discriminative stimulus, but it sets up a motivating operation. So I have down here, questions set the condition of an implied threat or an aversive state. Now, don't read into this implied threat thing too deeply. Let's focus on the aversive state. All of you, I am sure, as students, have felt this. It's probably even more salient when you are in class. When the professor asks you a question about the chapter, right? And maybe if you know the answer, you're golden, you move on. But when a question is asked, it does create an aversive state. That only providing the answer will remove that aversive state. And interestingly enough, the longer there is silence, the more aversive the condition becomes. All of us have had this experience, right? So that is an interesting exchange here, that when somebody asks you a question, it almost sets up an aversive condition that only delivering a response removes that aversive condition. And once again, that's sort of an extreme version where there is really aversiveness, particularly if you don't know the answer. But going around day-to-day activities, when I ask questions, doesn't mean that I'm trying to generate some aversive state. It's just that it's sort of a condition. It's the absence of something creates a little bit of an aversive state that we are motivated to escape. Okay, so a command is controlled by the motivating operation. It's reinforced by the verbal community in form of delivery of the specified reinforcer. So when we're teaching commands, the general approach would be to identify preferred items using a preference assessment, right? You know what those are. We've talked about that. We're going to select the command form. If I'm working with an individual who has no vocal abilities or have not demonstrated any vocal abilities, or they're very crude or rudimentary, limited sounds, I'm not going to select a vocal form of a man. I'm probably going to select a sign or a gesture or probably a picture card or the use of a device. Then I would begin trials. I'm going to use a preferred item, present the item with the correct response, M&M, and contingent on the man deliver the reinforcer. Right? So if this were a picture card exchange, it might look something like this. I place a picture card with an M&M in front of the individual. I hold up the M&M. Maybe I have to use some prompting and so forth early on, but the presence of the M&M should evoke the correct response. Once the picture card is exchanged, I deliver the reinforcer. So that's sort of the basic arrangement. Now, if motivation is not present, right? If the individual just had a big bag of M&Ms, I'm not going to be able to use M&Ms as a reinforcer. But we can contrive opportunities to man, and this is what's called a transitive CMO. We talked about this a couple chapters back. If you're unfamiliar, definitely reference back. But essentially, things we could do is contrive motivation by presenting maybe parts of a preferred activity or require a man to access other parts. So we could use sort of a set of instructions or building a puzzle and leaving pieces out, which prompts, or not prompts, rather occasions an opportunity for the individual to have to make a request. So it sets up a motivating operation. All right, the next basic verbal operand is the tact. And casually speaking, we could think of a tact as a description, just describing some stimulus. So formally, a tact is a verbal operand in which a response of a given form is evoked or strengthened by a particular object, event, or property of that object or event. So again, we're talking about describing a stimulus. The red ball, the black cat, the brown dog, right? So all of those descriptions are tacts. We are describing a stimulus. Now, when we think of the controlling variables, that's important for what we do. What are the controlling variables? Why does somebody tact an object? Well, it's maintained by generalized reinforcement, right? It's going to be under the control of a nonverbal SD. So we think of interactions with young children, right? When you're teaching them how to, colors or something like that, you have a ball and you say, what color is it? And they say red. And you say, great job, that's red. You're providing generalized condition reinforcement. The reinforcer is not gaining access to the ball. The reinforcer is good job, usually some form of academic reinforcer. Now, who does the tact benefit, right? Why does the ability to describe stimuli benefit a speaker or a listener? Well, it really benefits the listener, right? And again, I'm going to draw on parental examples. Every day when I pick my daughter up from school, what happened in school today? I don't know what happened in school because I was not there, but by her ability to tact it, it gives me a window into her world, so to speak. So I know what she did. So there is really an adaptive function to basic tacting. Now, again, we could look at it very simple and just say, well, we're teaching individuals how to describe objects or stimuli. That's red, that's round, that is square. And of course, there's benefit doing that. But eventually, the benefit really is to the listener, right? When I say, well, the person who almost hit you when you were riding your bike, what color was the car, right? Those things become important. Okay. So example, saying cat in the presence of a cat, saying black in the presence of black cat, Fluffy, my thing with cats there. So note how either the stimulus or a property of the stimulus evokes the response. And when we're teaching these, as I said, it's generalized reinforcement. In the presence of a cat, the child probably just early on, the child probably says, anything they know. And we may say, no, that's a cat. And then they say cat, and we say, great job, that's a cat. Then as we go on, we start to reinforce all these different tags. And you can imagine that something like this could generalize. When my daughter growing up with cats, she learned to say cat in the presence of cat pretty early on. When she saw a dog for the first time, she said cat. Right? Because that was the only way she knew how to describe what was in front of her. But then we taught dog and so forth. So the response is under control of the stimulus, and it's maintained by generalized reinforcement. Okay, so control the tact by a prior stimulus is established via generalized condition reinforcement. This is just simple. Good job. That is a cat. Good job. That is red. So we're going to reinforce these consistently, and it will establish stimulus control. Pure tacts, and again, I'm getting a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but pure tacts are going to be established with a completely generalized reinforcer. Like, once again, teaching ball in the presence of ball. When we do stuff like this can be interesting. If we're teaching ball in the presence of the ball and we give the child a ball, we don't know if that is a tact or a mand. Or it is a child saying ball because it is actually a ball and it's maintained by generalized condition reinforcement, or they saying ball to gain access to the ball. This is an important distinction within verbal behavior, that tacts and mands are very different. They're maintained by different things. They're under the functional control of different variables. So we teach them separately. In fact, we often teach mands first, right? Because we want to allow the individual to have control over the environment and so forth. But then we begin to teach tacts. I think in a lot of speech and language therapy, they approach this notion of we have to teach the concepts first. What is a ball? Before we teach other things like how to request a ball. So a little bit different there, and you'll learn all about that in ABA 513. So here's a diagram for a tact, right? In the presence of a ball, the speaker has access to it, the listener has access to it. The speaker says ball, in the speaker of a ball and an audience, the speaker says ball. You hear the discriminative stimulus, and we provide some reinforcement. Great job, that's a ball. So the effects on the listener is important, right? The tact works to benefit the listener. It extends the listener's contact with the environment. Okay, another listener. Speaker at the top, listener at the bottom, telephone requests. This doesn't really happen anymore because people have cell phones and you take your own calls. But there was a time where there was one phone in the house, and if somebody in the family got a phone call, somebody else may answer it. So a telephone request, there's an audience there. You say, telephone is for you. The listener hears that, they go to the phone, or they get the phone and say thanks. Okay. So again, these are distinct verbal operants. There's what we would call functional independence of mands and tacts. Just because one verbal operant is acquired does not mean the other one will be acquired too. So As mentioned, traditional accounts of language tend to focus on word meaning. The same word can show up in different forms of verbal behavior, but Skinner's analysis indicates that each is under the control of different variables. Man's are under the control of a motivating operation. Tacts are under control of the presence of a stimulus, and they're maintained by generalized condition reinforcement. Once again, it's just saying something like good job or yes, that's a ball.
So in these two,
the echoic is a verbal operant that occurs when a speaker repeats the verbal behavior of another speaker. So this is sort of, as you might imagine, echoing, right? I say something and the client says the same thing. So it's controlled by a vocal stimulus, a model, if you will. So when I say cat and the child says cat, there's an instance of an echoic. So it's controlled by a vocal stimulus. Here's where we add two more clarifications or two more conditions. An echoic has what we call point-to-point correspondence between the stimulus and the response. That is, the sound of the response matches the sound of a stimulus. So when I say cat, if the child said cot, there's no point-to-point correspondence, right? So it has to have the same vocal sound. The sounds have to match. It also has to have formal similarity. What I mean by formal similarity is the form has to match. So when I say cat, the child vocally says cat, right? If I say cat and the child writes the word cat, there's no formal similarity there. So that's not an echoic. Okay, so really you can think of it just in terms of somebody echoing back what you're saying. And this is a very basic unit of verbal analysis that we eventually, children come to engage in echoic behavior, right? When parents say a word, the child echoes it back. Okay, so once again, another diagram: speaker, listener, the audience. You know, when you're teaching these, you may say cat, right? The listener hears that. They provide the response, cat. You have a reduction in the threat because it's kind of like a question, right? Say cat. And then there's some reinforcer. Good job, that's cat, right? Or good job, correct. So again, it's the smallest verbal operant. You can even break it down, not necessarily into whole words, but you could even go into speech sounds or what we call phonemes. So this is how we might begin to shape more complex vocal responses. If an individual does not have a vocal repertoire, but they can make sounds, maybe even furthermore, they can make all the different letter sounds, or at least some of them, then there may be some basis for shaping more complex vocal responding. So an echoic, if I say k, k, and the child says k, k, that could be an echoic, right? And then I could have a basis for shaping more complex language from there. Okay, we're almost wrapped up here. And again, I know this is quite a bit. So without focusing too deeply on textual responses or transcription, a textual is simply a verbal operant under the control of a non-auditory stimulus. So reading a book or a set of instructions is you're engaged in textual behavior. There's point-to-point correspondence from what you've read is to what you sort of get out of the verbal operant, but there's no formal similarity, right? So if I read the word cat and I'm vocally saying it, there's no formal similarity. And this stuff is usually explicitly reinforced, right? We are taught to engage in textual behavior. We're taught to read text. Transcription is simply writing and spelling words that are spoken. So Once again, there's point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity. So when I say spell cat, the child has to write the word cat, and they're engaging in transcription. The last verbal operant we're going to cover is intraverbal, and this is really what the majority of our language or our vocal interactions consist of, are intraverbals. So it's a verbal operant in which the speaker differentially responds to the verbal behavior of others. It's just controlled by all the different vocal stimuli in a conversation. So it doesn't necessarily have point-to-point correspondence. But when we're engaged in conversations, for example, somebody asks you where to go to school, you respond GCU, right? Now we could look at that as a man for information, of course. But general conversation is made up largely of intraverbals. So the verbal community at a basic level consists of a listener and a speaker. The listener is important and their behavior is important because most verbal behavior occurs in the presence of a listener and ceases in the absence of a listener. Now, of course, people talk to themselves. I talk to myself as I go through my day. But really, most verbal behavior occurs in the presence of a listener, right? A listener is a discriminative stimulus that if we engage in some verbal behavior, it's likely to be reinforced in some way. So the audience actually controls verbal behavior. Verbal community establishes the reinforcing contingencies of language. And as I mentioned, this could be at the family level, the town or region level, cultural level, but also professionally, right? So in verbal or in behavior analysis, the way of speaking is established by the profession. Once again, if you say we reinforce the child, Dr. Perrin or myself are going to call you out and say, no, that's incorrect. We reinforce the child's behavior because that verbal community sets up those contingencies. So obviously, as I mentioned, verbal behavior can be overt. Most of the time it is. But sometimes it can be covert when we are sort of thinking out a problem of some sort, a solution to an issue. We may think in words, and those words are not observable. So this is where we start to, verbal behavior begins to really expand what our conceptual analysis entails. So tying in really with what Skinner referred to as radical behaviorism. So, even though we cannot observe thoughts and feelings and so forth, we assume that these let's just focus on thoughts. These private stimuli are really brought about and maintained the same way in which overt verbal behavior is. So it simply consists of more verbal behavior to be explained. Even if we can't see it, we might suspect that it's controlled by the same variables. So, it is a major obstacle to analysis if we can't see it. But why would it be any different than our overt verbal behavior? Well, let's think of ways in which private stimuli have an influence on our verbal behavior, right? So let's think of something like, I have some examples here, but let's choose a different one. A toothache or a stomach ache, right? How do children come to learn to say, well, this is a toothache, or that is a stomach ache, or how does the verbal community learn to ask about those questions? Well, we consider those tacts. There are public accompaniments to each of those private events, right? If I have a toothache, or if a child has a toothache, they're likely to hold the side of their mouth, right? When an adult sees a child doing that, they're going to say, "What's wrong?" And the child may say, "Well, my mouth hurts or my tooth hurts." And as an adult, you're probably going to say, "You may have a toothache or you may have a cavity." So when those instances occur, the child is learning that this internal stimulus that they are experiencing, well, that means a toothache. Now, the accuracy of that could be questionable, right? You need to go to a doctor to confirm, yes, you have a toothache, or that is a cavity, or you have a stomach ache, or worse, you have an ulcer, right? But nevertheless, the verbal community is shaping and maintaining that that children learn these things to describe what's happening internally, but it's still maintained by the verbal community, shaped and maintained by the verbal community. So an interesting area, once again, beyond the scope of this course. Okay, that is it. I realize there's quite a bit in this chapter. My recommendation to you is to really get a handle on the primary verbal operants, specifically the mand, the tact, and the echoic. The other stuff is definitely higher level that you'll cover in 513, but try to really get a grasp on the mand, the tact, and the echoic. Try to analyze the verbal diagrams. The textbook does a nice job of sort of pulling you through those, and I think you'll have a good foundation for learning more about verbal behavior in ABA 513. I will post these links. These are this is old footage of researchers Epstein and Skinner talking about some instances of verbal behavior in pigeons. Really fascinating stuff. Certainly it's dated, but I think if you're really interested in this stuff, you'll find these videos quite interesting. Okay, that is it.